Hi, it's Angelo Caruso. I've got some great selling tips I want to share with you right now, and they involve three areas of the sale that have plagued us for a long, long time. Sales is one of the oldest occupations, and you'd think we'd have it all figured out by now, but the truth is that there are nooks and crannies and psychology involved with selling, and even with all of our tools and modern communication, we still struggle with closing a deal. I want to talk in particular about three areas of the sale today. The first is the beginning of the sales presentation, when most salespeople want to capture the attention of the prospect. They want to create interest and establish positive expectation, and also develop some sort of prospect involvement so that the salesperson isn't the only one working during the sales presentation. The second area of interest is selling through conversation. It's the guts of the presentation, making sure that the prospect stays with you and doesn't drift. Also, ways that you can keep your AV, specifically PowerPoint, from working against you. Also, during the middle of the sales presentation, that is a critical time because you're trying to do something I call protect the close. And we'll talk more about that and why that's so important in just a minute. Finally, the third area that I'd like to discuss with you today involves the last part of the presentation, what some people feel is the most important part. It's the call to action. Some people refer to it as the close itself. And the idea with the close is that if you've done everything right up until then, the final bit of what you need to do in the sales presentation is organic and natural. There are no surprises. And a key to this, of course, will be that you're talking to the right person. So let's get started on some ideas that you can use to improve your sales. I hope you've got a pen or a paper, maybe you're keystroking, that would be fine too. But you want to incorporate these ideas as soon as possible into your sales presentation. Your revenue will be impacted almost immediately. I do have one little caveat, one little warning for you, in that selling is a little bit like golf. Even if you get quite a few tips in one day out on the golf course, you don't want to do too much to change your stroke at the same time. Just try one change at a time until you can measure and get some results. Otherwise, everything will go to pot and you'll have to start all over again. So just take a few of these changes and make them one or two at a time. Okay, here we go. Let's talk about the very beginning of the presentation and ways that you can capture attention. One trick that I've been using for years in my business as a professional speaker, I also sell a boatload of information products, is I establish what's called an incidental credential. Now, an incidental credential is a way to brag on yourself without seeming like you're bragging, without seeming pompous or arrogant. And the trick is to mention something interesting or something cool that you've done on your way to saying something else. So, for example, I might say to an audience, if I happen to be in front of an audience, and this would work with a single prospect as well. I might say something like, "It's really good to be with you today. I almost didn't get to come to this meeting because I was speaking in Greece last week and I had a little bit of trouble getting on the plane." Now, of course, they may be interested in the details of why I couldn't get on the plane, but the point is that I was speaking in Greece last week. And by saying that, I'm establishing the incidental credential that I am, in fact, an international speaker. You see, if I say it another way, it almost sounds arrogant right at the get. If I say to you, I'm an international speaker, or, I'm an international speaker and I'm so good I spoke in Greece last week in Europe, it just doesn't play the same way. So the incidental credential is kind of a, oh, by the way comment. You're saying, you're issuing the credential on your way to some other factoid or some other incident that you want to talk about. So the incidental credential is really good for that. It's creating, capturing attention of the prospect. Now, you also, in the beginning of your presentation, want to create interest and what we call in the speaking business, positive expectation. And a great way to do this is to stop acting like a salesperson. When you act like a salesperson, people will treat you like one, and that's not a compliment. I said earlier that sales has been around for thousands of years, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's perceived as a a compliment when someone treats you like a salesperson. I tell my sales coaching clients all the time to stop acting like a salesperson and start acting like a real person. Because when you act like a real person, the conversation's much more natural, much more organic. That's the second time I've mentioned that pair of words in this video presentation with you. That should be your ultimate goal, is to have the presentation proceed organically and naturally. Remember, we're building for something called the call to action. And so the more natural this seems and the more organic it seems, the more likely that you'll actually close at the end of your sales presentation. So to sell through conversation, you want to use something that we call in the business anchors and trial closes. Now, anchors are very simple. They tend to be what are sometimes referred to as yes questions. So I might say something very simple to you like, are you with me so far? Does this sound good to you? Does it seem like we might be a good fit? All very quick inquiries, all designed to get a yes from the prospect. And in fact, if you work to get a series of small yeses at the beginning of the presentation, it's much easier to get the big yes at the end of the presentation. This is the goal. So we want to keep working the yes questions and issuing what are called trial closes. Does it seem like we might be able to do something so far? Not including price. Are you interested in the product still? This type of a dialogue for anchors and trial closes. Many times during the middle part of the presentation, salespeople start to work against themselves. If, for example, you're using a preordained 56-slide PowerPoint presentation, the presentation becomes more about you than it does the prospect. You'll find that the prospect has gone into passive mode, listening, not participating a lot during the conversation. I recommend avoiding PowerPoint if you can, because it tends to uninvolve the most important person in the presentation, and that's the prospect. Remember that when you are talking, you are not learning anything, and you need to learn from the prospect. The only time you can be learning is when the prospect is speaking, and when you're giving your 56-slide PowerPoint presentation, the prospect isn't speaking at all. You also, in the middle of the presentation, need to protect the close. This is vitally important. You need to pre-call your time toward the beginning of the session by saying something to the prospect like, listen, I've blocked out about an hour. Is that okay with you? And when he says yes or she says yes, that is your permission now. That's clearance for the next 60 minutes. And why? I'll tell you why this is very, very important. If you need 15 minutes to close at the end of your presentation, you cannot afford for the prospect to say, oh, look, our time is just about up. Or, oh, I forgot, I've got an appointment and I have to run. Or have somebody knock on the door and interrupt you. You see, because the close always comes at the end of the presentation. And if the close takes you 15 minutes and the prospect starts shutting down at minute 35 or 40, you will be denied the close and you'll never walk out with a deal. So this strategy is called protecting the close, and it is vital. I recommend pre-calling your time at the very beginning of the program, and maybe even 20 minutes or 30 minutes in, you might say, now, we've got about 30 minutes left. Are we still okay on time? Again, now you're using two techniques at the same time. You're protecting the close and you're using the trial close or some sort of an anchor to keep the prospect with you. Very, very nice. So, a bunch of small yeses on the way to your big yes. At the end, ideally, there will be no surprises. Now, if you are involved with what's called a complex sale or a big ticket item, you want to make sure that at some point during the presentation, you've hinted at what the product or service will cost. I don't think that you should give the cost early on. In fact, I'm a big fan of pushing back against price, even if they ask you directly, what does your product cost? Well, I'd rather not get into that right now because I have a few questions for you that determine how much the product will cost you or the service will cost you. So if you don't mind, I'd like to talk about a few other things and then I'd be happy to give you a price. You see how I pushed back against price just now. Very, very cool. And but how do you push back against price and avoid surprises at the end of the presentation? Well, the trick for this is to give some sort of a price range, a zip code of where the price might be, so that the prospect isn't completely surprised at the end, and then you have to deal with the concept known as sticker shock. So the way to do this is you say something to the prospect like, look, I'm so glad we're able to talk about the features and benefits of this product and how it will benefit you and your customers. You know, I know you've asked me about how much it will cost, and as I said, there are many aspects to the deliverables that will determine what this is going to cost you, but I'm happy to tell you more about that in just a minute. If you held my feet to the fire, key phrase, if you held my feet to the fire, if you insisted that I give you some sort of number right now before we talk about the features and benefits, I'd probably say that this would cost somewhere between, little pause, between X and Y. And then again, a quick trial close. Is that out of your price range? Or does that sound reasonable to you, Mr. Prospect? If the prospect says it is not reasonable or it is out of their range, you can stop the presentation right there and say, well then, it would appear that we're not a very good fit. I certainly don't want to waste your time, and if you'd rather that we terminate this conversation right now, I would certainly understand. And you grab your papers and you make like you're headed for the door. If they let you leave, then they were never a qualified prospect in the first place. But if they say, well, wait a minute now, maybe we can do some creative financing, I always love that phrase, creative financing, or maybe we can work something out, or it's a little bit more than I plan to spend, but I'll bet we can work something out. Then you settle down, you put your papers back in place, and you proceed with the presentation. But now you're working with a price range without having actually given the prospect the exact figure, and that's pretty good. Finally, at the end of the presentation, and this is a kind of a reverse engineering of how most salespeople work. A lot of salespeople give their presentation. They do everything that I suggested in this little presentation to you today. They've achieved what we might call the perfect sale, and then guess what the prospect says? Great presentation. I'll have to talk to the decision maker, and we'll get back to you. Oops. We missed a very, very critical step in the process, and that is making sure that the decision maker is in the room. And you set this up very early on when you make the appointment by saying, is there anyone else in the decision, involved with this decision, that will have a stake in the outcome? Is there anybody else involved with the decision? They might say something like, well, my sales manager, or my CFO, or my CEO, and you try then to get the CEO or the CFO or that key person to the meeting. It is very, very important that you do this. You do not want to be surprised at the end of the sales presentation either. So this is a very quick summary of what needs to be done to achieve what we call the perfect sale. And when you hit all of your marks, like an actor, when you hit all of your marks, you're standing in the light, the camera's on you, the microphone's within reach, you'll find that your sales will skyrocket. Now, in most cases, your salespeople, you, if that's the case, your sales team will have to change lifelong habits in order to put these changes into place. And to do that, they'll have to become real students of the selling tradecraft. I offer sales coaching it's a curriculum that happens over many, many weeks. And of course, I also keynote live events where we try to help salespeople achieve the perfect sale every single time. More information about what I do and more free selling tips at michaelangelocaruso.com. I wish you well and happy selling.